Here's the weather forecast for the inshore waters of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. The following 24 hours issued by the Met Office at 2 p.m. on Monday, the 15th of July. The general situation: a complex area of low pressure across Wales and southern England will move into the southern North Sea today. A weak ridge of high pressure will build from the west from tomorrow.
From this conversation, thinking that I must be one of the most terribly old-fashioned, antiquated, British face people in Britain, because I happen to think that stealing is wrong. It is what something literally wrong as well.
The whole thing. No, look, what stealing is moral? Is it immoral?
Yes.
So it's not immoral then when you have a cost of living crisis and people are starving. People are living on the streets. Charlotte Rampling, the actress, you worked with Charlotte Rampling. I used to be friends with her cousin, and she worked for a big supermarket in the bakery. And she threw a bag of donuts in the skip at the end of the day, and she was under instruction from the company that if anybody got in there to get those donuts out, or the loaf of bread, or the cake, or whatever, out of that skip, she was to phone the police and have them arrested for theft. Now, you know, this is madness. That is mad. Now, what kind of an attitude says that? You know, why not take all that produce that's going to waste, take it to the prisons, take it to the hospitals?
Oh, I totally agree with that. I think food waste is verging on the criminal. In fact, we were having
a cost of living crisis, the 2 billion profit on top of whatever the profit was last year. Let's say it was 2 billion then. So you've got 4 billion profit, and they're complaining that somebody's bit the packet of bourbon biscuits. And then they wonder why the people stand in pubs says we're so wrong. And they wonder why, like was mentioned earlier on, you know, you're walking down the street and all of a sudden the crackhead Colin calls you and says, look, do you want this £20 lump of steak for a fine? And people say, yeah, okay. You know, you can see their point. But that's that point anyway. But the other one is immigration. Now, what are these people doing when they get here? In the part of Bristol I grew up in 3 streets, only 3 streets, there are 25 barbershops. 25. And very rarely do you see anybody in any of them. Now, what are they doing there? The council used to... No, there's nobody in there. There's nobody in there getting a haircut. You go by there, all empty. You might occasionally see the odd person in there. Now, the council's years ago, if you had a barbershop, and I tried to open one up 3 doors up the road, they wouldn't allow me to. Because that service is already being catered for in that area. Which I thought was absolutely the right way to do it. But not now. You've got 25 that's barbershops. Then you've got tattoo shops. Then you've got nail shops.
I hear what you're saying, but there is a sort of configuration of the particular that I see in the 2 cities I live in, London and Luton. I see nail bars, hairdressers, kebab shops, betting shops, and they all sort of interlaced, aren't they, across the street. There's no excuse, I don't think, anyway, for stealing from them. Thank you, Frank. Let's finish with Mike, who is in East Yorkshire. Good morning, Mike.
Well, nice to have on a bit earlier for a change.
Thanks.
Blood's been boiling since Mike from Scotland came on and blamed farmers for abandoning the local community. We as a family employed casual labour at pinch points in the agricultural seasons, and everything been quite happy. And that's 50s, 60s, early 70s. What happened at that point was that women who would generally stay at home until then would come and earn a quarter of the tax threshold by the Standards 3 grand programme a year, helped out at peak points, started to get jobs and careers, and families needed 2 wages, not 1 wage and a little bit of part-time work. The supply of labour completely dried up. We have no choice but to import labour. We did not abandon the local workforce. They abandoned us, if you like, for a good reason. It's completely the opposite of what Mike from Scotland was saying. We did not abandon the local workforce.
It used to be, the seasonal work, it used to be a point of local celebration. when, people would earn a little bit of extra money in the summer picking hops or potatoes or apples, depending on what part of the UK you come from. Now it seems to be so degrading to do that,
I'm sure people wouldn't find it degrading, but the whole employment system's changed. And I'm sure people would come and they'll do it. And believe it or not, you can easily earn 20 to 25 quid an hour doing casual work on farms now. It's not a bad wage, but one thing you maybe won't be aware of. Ask you a question. Which two countries supply most of our seasonal labour now? No, Poland went out the market in the 80s. It's now Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. And the reason for that is they can earn 3 quid an hour at home, 15, 20 quid an hour here. It went on to Romanians and Bulgarians after they joined the EU, but even in Romania and Bulgaria they can earn 10, 12 pounds an hour. They're not going to come over here for 15.
Mike, I'm going to have to leave it there. I think we've had an extensive conversation, if not expansive.
It's Midnight GMT. Hello, I'm Rahul Tandon, and this is Business Matters here on the BBC World Service. And today we're live in the world's two largest economies, China and the USA, where just 2 days after an attempt on his life, Donald Trump's running mate is announced at the Republican National Convention.
I formally declare Donald J. Trump and J.D. Vance as the Republican nominees for President and Vice President of the United States.
We're going to look at some of the important economic issues that will be tackled at the convention, including trade with China.
If you're serious about declaring economic independence from China in certain critical sectors, like pharmaceuticals, that actually means more trade, not less trade with allies.
That's Business Matters here on the BBC. First, though, let's get the latest BBC News.
Hello, I'm Neil Nunes with the BBC News. The man chosen by Donald Trump as his running mate in the US presidential election, J.D. Vance, has been formally approved as the vice presidential nominee. His candidacy was confirmed in a unanimous vote on the first day of the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. The Ohio senator is a former US Marine, businessman, and an author. David Willis has more details.
He is 39 years of age. That is roughly 40 years younger, would you believe, than Donald Trump. And some are saying that this represents a sort of passing of the torch as far as the MAGA right wing is concerned on the part of Donald Trump. This is a man who supports that Make America Great Again doctrine of right wing populism. And Mr. Vance wasn't always a fan of Donald Trump. He once likened the former president to Hitler, but he's since become a full-throated defender of the Trump agenda.
President Biden described Mr. Vance as a clone of Trump. The director of the U.S. Secret Service, Kimberly Cheetle, has described the assassination attempt on Donald Trump on Saturday as unacceptable, but said she would not resign from her post as it was her responsibility to investigate what went wrong. Meanwhile, the FBI says it's gained access to the phone of the gunman Thomas Matthew Crooks. The White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre relayed President Biden's comments about the latest developments.
The president spoke about an ongoing investigation, and as he said, we do not know the motive of the shooter yet. We don't know his opinions or affiliations.
Genocide and the country's president since the year 2000. Only 2 opposition candidates were allowed to run against him this time after the Electoral Commission, at the request of the government, banned his most prominent critics. Human rights groups frequently accuse his government of stifling the media and political opposition with arbitrary detentions, assassinations, and disappearances. It's also facing allegations of encouraging instability in neighboring Democratic Republic of Congo.
This is the latest world news from the BBC. Hungary has reacted angrily after the EU said it would only send senior civil servants, but not its commissioners, to informal meetings organised by Hungary during its presidency of the bloc. President Viktor Orban was censored by EU leaders when he undertook a self-styled peace mission to Kiev, Moscow and Beijing earlier this month. Scientists have for the first time discovered a cave on the moon. It's thought to be at least 100 meters deep. Italian researchers identified the cave by using radar to penetrate a pit on the lunar surface. They say it could be an ideal place for humans to build a permanent moon base. Professor Leonardo Carrera from the University of Trento in Italy says the cave would be a natural and familiar choice.
The history of humanity, we started from caves, and because it's a natural shelter, it's just already an engineering feature. And so if you bring this idea to the moon, a lot of things already sort of sorted out, the protection from meteorites, from radiations and so on, like you don't need really complex engineering solutions to solve this problem. It's already solved by nature in a way.
Miami police have confirmed that the president of the Colombian Football Federation, Ramon Hezron, was arrested following the final of the Copa America in Florida. Mr. Hezron and his son Ramon Chamil are accused of battery following a brawl with security guards. There's been no comment from Mr. Hezron. Video of the fight has gone viral on social media. The captain of Spain's victorious football team has held aloft the European Championship Cup before a crowd of jubilant fans in the Plaza de Cibeles in Madrid. Alvaro Morata said he had been blessed to lead such a talented squad, adding that their victory had been achieved because of the belief of the nation. BBC World News.
Hello and welcome to Business Matters here on the BBC World Service. I'm Russell Camden. One main story really that we'll be focusing on. The Republican convention has got underway, of course, just more than 48 hours after that assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump. Plenty of reaction to that and also what's taking place at the convention. As always, I'll be joined throughout the programme by two guests on opposite sides of the world perspective. University of Maryland. It has been quite an extraordinary weekend, hasn't it, in the US? Dealing with
The setup brigade to someone like Donald Trump is the victim of a sniper, and that the Secret Service is found to have been so inept in this case. It's really shocking. Exactly what happened. It's kind of like the Postal Service. And it turns around and it nominates a 39-year-old with very little political experience. Though I will say this, at this point in time, United and Kamala Harris have similar experience. She's a first-term senator, a couple of years in the Senate, not much accomplished, not much of a platform. So, you know, it's a mirror image in a lot of ways. And he's very much a Trump echo. And he's sort of a standby equipment. If you elect Donald Trump and something happens to him, you're going to get a carbon copy.
we are talking there about J.D. Vance, who has been nominated for part of that ticket. Donald Trump and Mr. Vance on it. Also with us, Jennifer Pat, China correspondent with America Public Media. People know you work for America Public Media there in Shanghai. Jennifer, people have been talking to you about the events.
No, because all things about America or politics is sort of quite sensitive. I mean, in private, of course, they're very surprised, and I'm also quite impressed that he survived. And there's a lot of chatter about how he has such political acumen. He remembered to, raise his fist, shout. That's theatrics. That's sort of how people in China are viewing this, is that it's political theater.
We will come back to that. It must have been a very difficult moment for President Trump as he sort of felt the bullet coming towards him. But let us start with the U.S. Republican National Convention because it has begun in Milwaukee, in the swing states of Wisconsin.
Delegates and alternate delegates, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2024 Republican National Convention.
And as Peter told us at the top of the program, we now know who'll be on the ticket with him. J.D. Vance has been unveiled as Donald Trump's running mate.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am proud to announce that Senator J.D. Vance has the overwhelming support of this convention to be the next Vice President of the United States.
Kathy Brokammer is a delegate at the convention from Wisconsin. She hailed Mr. Vance as a perfect candidate.
He is very dedicated. He has been an incredible patriot. He came from nothing in his life. Really very, very poor when he was young and came up. This is part of the American dream. He has a great vision for America. He's very strong. We love him. He's absolutely just a perfect choice.
Kathy quite happy there. Let's bring in the BBC's Nomia Iqbal, who is at the convention. Nomia, thanks for joining us. Not a huge surprise, the nomination of Mr. Vance.
Well, it was interesting because even up until the last minute, there were some suggestions that Donald Trump was going to pick someone that nobody had really been talking about. Certainly that was what he indicated. So you got the sense that he's a showman. He was, of course, the guy behind The Apprentice, that he wanted to create some sort of drama there. But J.D. Vance was, for a long time, seen as the favourite. But it is interesting because it was only a few years ago he did not like Trump. Just to quote him, he once said, "I'm another Trump guy. I never liked him. My God, what an idiot. I find him reprehensible." And other things. He even wrote privately to an associate on Facebook, and he said, quote, "I go back and forth between thinking Trump is a simple swear word that I can't say, or that he's America's Hitler." But how things have changed and have completely turned. J.D. Vance is now Donald Trump's VP.
Suppose that is the world of modern politics to some extent. You're there at the convention, because people across the world saw those events over the weekend. What is the mood of the convention? Is it a difficult one to balance? I'm sure people are still shocked at those events, but they also want to display to America what the ideals of the Republican Party are.
People are shocked, people are upset, supporters of Donald Trump in Milwaukee itself, in Wisconsin, also those at the convention. But what it's done is it's solidified support for him. If Donald Trump supporters were ever in any doubt about their loyalty to him, which I don't think they were, they are definitely not now. For many of them, it almost makes them sort of like even more of a strong mythical figure within the MAGA political movement. They are completely 100% behind him. And when I was down in the floor, where the delegates are, it was just, the atmosphere was buzzing. People were so excited. And he will appear at some point this evening. We don't know if he's going to give a speech, but he will accept the nomination to be the presidential candidate later on this week, and that will be a good moment.
Because he's due to speak on Thursday, and it's interesting that since the attempt on his life, he hasn't really spoken publicly, has he?
He hasn't, and the only thing we've heard from him since the attempted assassination was an interview that he gave to a newspaper in which he said he hopes to strike a tone of unity, that his speech will focus more on that rather than President Biden's policies. But he does have his Truth Social Network site, and he has been putting comments on there. So that's as much as we've heard from him. But we will get that speech from him later this week. As I mentioned, he is appearing tonight, but we don't know yet if he's going to take the stage.
Nomia, thank you so much for joining us. Peter, you first here. It was very difficult, wasn't it? You know, an assassination attempt on former President Trump is very difficult for the Republican Party to deal with, difficult for him to deal with. But as Nomia said there, the political acumen, yes, it's quite incredible, isn't it?
We've seen it before. Ronald Reagan made some remarkable statements right after he was hit. There was an assassination attempt while he was in office. He was taken to the George Washington University Hospital at 23rd Street, and he made a rather, stunning remark. He had his wits about him. It seems as though people that are capable of this level of leadership, whether it's people like, Donald Trump, and at the other extreme, Barack Obama, have a presence of place and time and space that sets them apart. That's kind of like that X factor that makes them so attractive to people. They never really, it's like this. Troy Aikman was probably the greatest quarterback of my generation. And he always knew exactly, or say, the fellow in Kansas City, they always know exactly where they are in the field, even in the most adverse of circumstances. That's Donald Trump. Honestly, Joe Biden has that capacity. That's how they get to the top. And in some ways, Donald Trump showed his chops by doing that. Think what you want of the man and his behavior and so forth, but now you understand how he got there.
And how does it change the presidential race? It seems callous to talk about that when somebody lost their life in this attack, but it is going to change the presidential race, isn't it?
Well,
or is it?
It is, because Joe Biden is coming off a very rough period, and going into the weekend, he really hadn't recovered. He had his press conference, and even the people that you'd expect to support him, the mainstream media like the New York Times and Bloomberg Wire, didn't say it was enough. There was real concern that he just didn't have it anymore. And honestly, I love Joe Biden. The fact that I disagree with him on so many policies, I truly respect what he is, and I understand what he stands for. We differ, but I really respect Joe. It was all going badly for him. And now Donald Trump getting shot has a triumph. You put the two together. Normally, neither of those events are the kind that you can't overcome or that you can capitalize on indefinitely, but you put the two together. Let's see what the polls have to say 7 days from now. It takes 3 to 4 days for the electorate to digest an event. They have a knee-jerk reaction, and then they calm down and assimilate it. And then the polling data, the polls that are taken 3 and 4 days later, which come out 7 and 8 days later, are the effect. It'll be interesting to see what the polls look like the 4th week of July. My feeling is that the polls at the 4th week of July show Donald Trump with a commanding lead in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or Michigan. Joe Biden is in real trouble.
Well, we're going to talk about Mr. Biden in a few minutes' time, but the Republican convention is taking place in Milwaukee. Let us talk to the mayor of Milwaukee, Cavalier Johnson. Thank you so much for joining us on the program, Mayor. Firstly, your reaction to the events of the weekend?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. First and foremost, the events that happened this past weekend were atrocious. They were horrible. They should not happen to any person. No one in this country should have that sort of violence that befalls them. It doesn't matter if you're a kid going to school. It does not matter if you're somebody going to a grocery store. And it certainly doesn't matter if you're a candidate for president of the United States. So I was appalled, and I think that most Americans were appalled to see that sort of action taken with attempted assassination on a candidate for president and former president at that.
Can I put a question to you that many people around the world are talking about? Is this an example, unfortunately, of the consequences of America being so divided, of the political discourse on both sides being so extreme?
Well, I think this. I think that President Joe Biden, just the other night in his address to the nation from the Oval Office, struck the tone that we should be striving for here in the United States. President Biden called out the fact that we're Americans. At the end of the day, we're all a part of the same American family. We're not enemies. We're not brothers. We're neighbors. We're friends. We're co-workers. We're all part of the same family. And I have been thinking a lot about American independence and everybody gathering around and supporting the idea of America. And in just a couple of short years, we're going to celebrate 250 years of American democracy, 250 years of supporting this commonality between all of us as Americans. And I think it's high time for us to get back to that.
Let us see what happens in terms of the rhetoric during the rest of the campaign. In terms of security itself, you are the mayor of Milwaukee. I'm sure there are heightened security concerns here.
Absolutely, there are, and there's some background to that. So many months ago, prior to the events on Saturday, myself, I worked with a number of folks in a bipartisan fashion, including members of Congress, including our county executive here in Milwaukee, David Crowley, to bring additional resources to support the Republican National Convention. So the funding for these events have been stuck at $50 million since 2004. We advocated for an additional $25 million in Congress. We received those dollars, and those resources are helping us with security around the convention. The difference between the rally on Saturday and the RNC in Milwaukee now is that this event, unlike that rally, is designated as NSSE, a National Special Security Event, meaning it's got the highest designation of security event that's provided by the United States government.
Can I ask you about your Democratic leader, President Biden? He has been giving an interview with NBC that I think is going to air in about 40 minutes in the US. I'm sure people are going to watch it very closely. Bits and bats of it beginning to come out already. What do you make of President Biden's campaign so far? Some of the gaps that we've seen and the growing pressure from some Democrats, it's still a minority, for him to stand down. Where do you stand on that?
Where do I stand on that? I stand firmly in the corner of President Joe Biden. I always have. I think that this president has a remarkable record to run on. He's president of the United States today, and he's doing a great job today. And when you think about some of the pieces of legislation that he's been successfully able to guide through Congress and enact into law that have benefited not just my city, Milwaukee, but the state of Wisconsin, and indeed the entire country. The bipartisan infrastructure, the bipartisan CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the American Rescue Plan Act, and so many other things that have positively impacted people on the ground in communities, not just here, but across the country. And he's got an agenda, a positive agenda for the American people.
He said he has,
in the second term.
Do you feel that he still has the capabilities to be president? You are a young man, you sound a young man, you're only 38 years old, and you go out
37.
Forgive me, 38 on election day. So I did you a disservice there. But when you go out and talk to people, in their 30s, people younger than you, can they relate to President Biden? You must understand their concerns when you see some of the things that he's done.
Oh, well, my thing is you judge the totality of the job done, not one particular incident, right? The debate was a 90-minute incident where the president admits himself that he did not do well. He didn't do well, and we can see that he was sick and all these other things. He accepts the responsibility for that and would like to move on from that and continue to show that he can do the job. He's been showing that over the course of the last 2 weeks. And when I go out and talk to people in my city about who they're going to vote for in the upcoming election, every person that I talk to, especially in the demographics that really will sway this election, I'm talking about African Americans, Black men in particular, they all tell me that they will be voting for President Joe Biden because they know his policies positively affect our community.
Well, maybe they say that because you're a Democrat and they don't want to upset you. Listen, it's been a real pleasure talking to you on the program. Thank you so much for joining us, and good luck in Milwaukee with the convention. Last one to you, I presume it brings some revenue into the city.
Yeah, I mean, the projections, third-party projections, is that it'll bring in roughly $150 to $200 million.
Well, there we go. That is not bad. Thank you so much, Cavalier Johnson, there, Milwaukee Mayor. Want to bring in Jennifer quickly. I mean, the Chinese, I think we're going to come to what's happening in China at the moment. It's a pretty important week there as well. I'm sure they're closely following this, aren't they, in terms of whether it's President Biden, whether it's President Trump. Do you think they have very different strategies for both of them?
Yes and no. People are interested, but fundamentally, people in China don't have a say in the US election, much like they don't have with their own leaders here. So a lot of times they're just looking at it as observers, because at the heart of it, there is a belief that nothing is really going to change, regardless of which candidate is chosen as president. I mean, you look at both of them, they have been president or are president, and the attitude towards China has only intensified. The only difference is that under Trump, that's when the tit-for-tat tariffs began, and then under Biden, it's continued, and then more sanctions were added on, and now you have extra tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles and chips being sanctioned from Chinese companies using them. The message has always been that, at least from the American side, that China is a strategic competitor, and what that means is officially they want to trade on all things other than national security or whatever else the US doesn't like. And so people in China don't believe that the relationship is necessarily going to improve, although there is a little nickname for Trump called Jianguo, which means to help the country build. They believe that all of these policies against China actually help China become more self-sufficient and fast-track some of the stated goals anyways from the Chinese government, which is on self-reliance and to build up its national security.
What's happening at the Republican convention in Milwaukee is a key spot on the stage where somebody who also stood for that presidential nominee against Donald Trump, now a big supporter of him. Peter, do you think one thing that may happen now is because there is so much focus on the events of the last 48 hours, security, how it happened, why it happened, that to some extent maybe we won't talk so much about the policies from the Republican convention that we would have done previously?
Well, I think that's the case. I think it benefits Republicans because some of the policies in that platform are really ridiculous and extreme. I've written like what? Well, for example, their tax policy. We already have a 7% GDP deficit, and they want to cut taxes some more. Their tariff policy, on the surface, it looks reasonable. Well, let's put a 20%, 10% tariff on imports from every place. Do we really want to do that to the Europeans when they're struggling with deficits and at our urging or we're building their militaries? Do we really want to do that to Germany and to France? I don't think so. On immigration policy, do you really think they're going to manage mass deportation when we have millions of people in this country illegally? And I have pointed out, in the media in the United States that they are positively contributing to the U.S. economy. We need a more reasoned immigration policy than what's in that platform. Frankly, that platform is not Donald Trump's friend because it's a good thing to run against.
Well, listen,
and I'm a conservative.
You are indeed, as we've done many times on the program. We are always delighted to have you on as well. I just wanted to interrupt you there because we're coming up to news, but I want to listen now to Carlos Trujillo, the former U.S. ambassador to the Organization of American States, supporter of Donald Trump. He's at the convention. I asked him what policies were likely to come out of it.
It's the agenda that he's championed. It's the agenda that puts America first. It's the agenda that looks to control the inflation, to grow the economy, to cut taxes, to control the illegal migration into the country, and to put the United States back on the global stage as a world leader. Given all the conflicts and the difficulty we faced under the last 3.5 years of President Biden.
Carlos, many people look at the U.S. before what took place and look at it as a country that is divided, not just politically, but also economically as well. Do you think that the events of the weekend could lead to a change in policy? And he may move a little bit more towards it?
I think Donald Trump is very clear in his agenda. Donald Trump obviously didn't shoot himself, right? So I think there really needs to be movement, and there needs to be a lot more grace shown by people constantly equivocate Donald Trump to the end of democracy and the end of the free world. And I think those are very dangerous statements that we continue to hear coming from a lot of people in the left-wing media, attacking the former president and putting it in a binary choice that if he's elected, the world will come to an end, lead to these outbreaks of violence. Donald Trump's agenda is not left, it's not right, it's much more putting the American family and the American worker first. It was his agenda 2016, it's going to be his agenda going forward.
And we see that probably more than anywhere else in his economic policies. What do you think the overriding economic message you want to come out of this convention?
We feel focus on energy infrastructure, we focus on energy independence, we focus on a strong border, we bring and repatriate American jobs that have been shipped to China, and we participate in free and fair trade. It's the policy along with the tax cuts and implementing investments. And I'm sure it'll be aggressive, but re-implementing on these like this. Those are the policies that are going to drive the forward.
A lot of policies that we want to have reacted to some of them when we come back after the next. Well, we're back with Business Matters in just a moment. Let's first tell you what's coming up on the BBC World Service. In our assignment visits an Australian-based charity to investigate how their rescue centres don't exist. Then it's Outlook.
Imagine being told everyone you know will be sent intimate images of you unless you hand over $2,500. It's blackmail, and it's exactly what happened to Patsy Frank-San.
And at 3:30 GMT in the studio, the Taipei-based artist Han Xiaolin.
It looks kind of archaeological, and then there's like the look of the ceramics is kind of like a skin coat that kind of achieved.
And at bbcworldservice.com, Elizabeth Forbister debating air pollution, inequality and corruption in Mongolia. Questions.
The past history says that when you have more volume, Russia's social protection policies, education policies, health policies do increase.
All that's coming here on BBC World Service.
You're listening to Business Matters here on the BBC World Service. We have Peter in the US, we have Jennifer in China. Policies moving forward. We'll get reacting to that. We will also talk a little bit more about China-US trade, and why are companies, some of the world's biggest ones, saying that more needs to be done to protect nature, and they're not able to do it.
BBC News with Damian Yamowiecka. J.D. Vance, the man chosen by Donald Trump as his running mate in the US presidential election, has been formally approved as the Republicans' vice presidential nominee. The Ohio senator's candidacy was confirmed on the first day of the Republican National Convention. Meanwhile, the director of the US Secret Service has described the assassination attempt on Donald Trump on Saturday as unacceptable, but said she would not resign from her post. Kimberly Cheatle said it was her responsibility to investigate what went wrong. Initial results indicate Paul Kagame is on course to be re-elected president of Rwanda with about 99% of the votes. He's ruled the country since 2000. Scientists have for the first time discovered a cave on the lunar surface. Researchers say it could be an ideal place for a permanent moon base. Hungary has reacted angrily after the EU said it would not send its commissioners to informal meetings organised by Hungary during its presidency of the bloc. President Viktor Orban was censured by EU leaders when he undertook a self-styled peace mission to Kyiv, Moscow and Beijing earlier this month. More than 130 companies with a combined revenue of more than $1 trillion are calling on governments to enact tough goals to reach a UN target of halting nature loss by the end of the decade. They include Unilever and Danone. Miami police have confirmed that the president of the Colombian Football Federation, Ramon Jesurun, was arrested following the final of the Copa America in Florida. Mr. Jesurun and his son are accused of battery following a brawl. Spain's victorious men's football team have been showing off the European Championship Cup to a huge crowd in Madrid. It followed their 2-1 victory over England in Sunday's final. Earlier, the players were welcomed at the Royal Palace and the Prime Minister's residence and also toured the city on an open-topped bus. BBC World News.
Welcome back to Business Matters here on the BBC World Service. Republican National Convention continuing. We have two big TV screens in the studio. You can see many people on the floor waving flags, waving banners with Donald Trump's name on them. They all seem to be where they are expecting to see him on the convention podium the next couple of hours. Peter, let's just pick up on some of the points that we were talking about there before. We've talked a lot, and there's been a lot of debate over the last 48 hours about how politically divided the US is. Give us a sense as an economist, how economically divided is the country?
Well, from the point of view of policy, we're terribly divided. There are many people who think that, you know, the legacy of the 19th century wholly defines the 21st century. You know, slavery and things like that, income inequality, race, gender identity politics. And there are others like myself who say, you know, after 8 generations, you're responsible for your own destiny. And these differences in circumstances are largely due to how much effort people put in. Circumstances at birth help, but look at J.D. Vance. You know, he rose from nothing. My father was a door-to-door salesman. My mother was a clerk in the school, and she was the lady that took the lunchroom money. At 18, I decided to get a PhD in economics, and that was a transformative event. Even though I was in a state teachers college in an isolated place in the Adirondack Mountains, America offers extraordinary opportunities, and my story is not extraordinary. I have classmates who did remarkable things. And so my feeling is we're divided on the story of America. But in reality, America still functions. One of the things I look at is where were we before the pandemic and where are we now? Wall Street Journal looked at that, and they came to the conclusion most countries have sort of gotten back to where they were before. Where were we not just before, but where we expected to be before the pandemic happened.
It's an incredible story.
It's really remarkable how much the economy has grown and how much Trump and Biden have made that happen. So my feeling is the country is divided in terms of rhetoric. It's not divided in the story, in the sense that people continue to succeed.
That is a really interesting segue into what we're going to talk about next. And we'll get Jennifer's thoughts on this. Firstly, because we have one of the most important events in the Chinese political calendar that has begun today. The meeting known as the Third Plenum takes place roughly every 5 years. And Jennifer, why is it so important?
Well, because it's supposed to map out long-term social and economic policies, and if you understand China's economy, the government directs a lot of it, so it's all about sentiment, and they're going to release announcements that are very vaguely worded, and everyone's going to parse through it very carefully, read between the lines, because what they're looking for is a general direction. And here's why it matters, because the moment, for example, when Xi Jinping came into power and he said, I'm going to crack down on corruption, you know what happened? Banquets suddenly collapsed. That whole business, luxury business, went down because all of these officials that were receiving these bribes or presents, let's say, all this alcohol, the sales plummeted, all of that trickles down. So everyone's looking for a signal, and boy, do they need a signal right now, because the numbers just came out yesterday of the economy, and in the second quarter, China's economy did not grow as fast as the first, and much lower than what analysts had expected.
Yeah, it certainly did. Let's bring in Han Lin, familiar voice on the program from the Asia Group. They're based in Shanghai. Han, thanks for joining us once again. Jennifer talked about a signal. What sort of signal can we expect to come out when the meeting finishes?
So essentially, when we look at the signals, there's going to be a couple of things that are going to be looked at. I think number one, people want to know, to what extent the government's going to step in to help out the economy. Second, the overcapacity issue. To what extent the Chinese leadership characterizes the external environment, that gives an indication to what extent they think that overcapacity is a concern for the Chinese leadership. And particularly, there's going to be a lot of attention to look at to what extent the government will step in and help support consumption. Because certainly among the different leverage to play with on the Chinese economy, the consumption area is the one thing that seems to be the weakest. In many ways, probably by the weakness of the property sector. The question is, what can help replace that? And some of the signaling that's come so far is that it might have to come through technology and self-resilience, but how this all plays out over the next 5 to 10 years, that's still going to be a work in progress.
It is going to be a work in progress, isn't it, Peter? Some people say that the Chinese government, give us your economist viewpoint on this, Peter, should literally put money into people's bank accounts in China to get them spending again. But would that even work?
Oh, it would work. I think we did it. We we did it with
But
the
it's a
savings
different
and loan
culture,
crisis
isn't it?
when
Isn't
we
it?
done it for something. And we did it, during the global financial crisis. Those were both property crises, and it works. The trouble is the legacy of all that, in terms of people determining that they can take outrageous risk, and the government will bail them out, causes them to take more outrageous risks. The other thing, I don't like President Xi very well, but I sure respect his brain. He is very conscious of the notion of not creating an environment where businesses will do reckless things and welfareism among the general population, where they expect the government to personally bail them out, provide for their circumstances, and so forth. He doesn't want to fall into the trap that the French are in right now, or the British are in, where they don't have much flexibility to do the things national government should do, because their budgets are fully committed with high levels of taxes to supporting welfare programs. He doesn't want to get into that situation. And what economists say that he can solve this problem by running the printing presses, printing money, and spending it in the property sector and giving people money to consume and so forth, are basically advocating that he turn China into France. And I think that he resists that very smartly.
Jennifer, Peter always says many interesting things. One of the points that he was talking about there was business and this idea, that President Xi, we've seen him seem to clamp down on some business. In a way, though, has that harmed the economy because people are not so willing to take risks?
I think it dampened business sentiment, but no doubt, like Peter had pointed out, President Xi had actually taken some actions that economists have been urging the Chinese government to take for a long time, which is do not rely on this housing bubble, which had been in play for over 2 decades. I mean, people here really believed that, well, first of all, they have very limited investment options, so that's why it's dumped into housing. But secondly, there was this belief that you cannot lose. And it also bred this culture where people thought that returns on investment of 12%, 14% was low. They thought it was moderate risk to invest in the welfare fund, which is exactly. And I looked at them and said, "Are you kidding me?" This is when Evergrande happened with the big property developer. I mean, why that roiled through all of the stock markets was because when they ran out of money to build these apartments, they were selling these so-called wealth management products, which was offering 11% returns, I think, at one point, maybe even higher. And I interviewed some investor who has like 20-some properties on hand, and I said, "How in the world could you have thought that this was a safe investment?" And he said, "Well, because I was getting it for years on end." And of course,
Jennifer was in full flow, and we just managed to do so for a few seconds. But the point we got there from Jennifer, I think, is a point that many people make about China. What can we expect to come out of this? We're not going to see money in people's bank accounts, but President Xi needs to get people spending again. How is he going to convince them to do that?
So one of the things that she is definitely trying to do is to figure out how do you build a better social safety. I think one of the assumptions is if there was better health care, if the pensions were better funded and people felt like the retirement were safer, they might be more willing to spend now. But I think the challenge is right now is the mindset of the population is still in the perspective that growth will keep coming and that the government will step in. And I think the government's trying to avoid this concern of moral hazard, where people's behavior will be going off the wrong track if they assume the government will keep stepping in. But one thing is definitely true for all the businesses going on. It is clearly not a high growth environment. And what we're starting to see in areas such as Shanghai and across all the cities is that the same skill sets that you have to grow a business are not the same skill sets in a downturn. And in that sense, many businesses are starting to face a reckoning, and that is the challenge in the economy of people are willing to take risks.
Let us go back to talking about the Republican convention, which is continuing at the moment. One of the areas where we're going to see, I think, quite a lot of discussion there is about China and the economic relationship between the world's two great economic superpowers. I've been speaking to Vivek Ramaswamy, who recently ran for the Republican presidential nominee, and he was tipped to be in Donald Trump's cabinet if he wins that election in November. I spoke to Vivek on Friday before the attempt on Trump's life and spoke to him about those trading relationships.
You know what? The United States of America cannot depend on countries like China to provide our own military equipment and to provide our own pharmaceuticals. A country cannot possibly depend on an adversary for sectors critical to its national security.
What about electric vehicles? Because where do you stand on that? It's the same. But that makes those products more expensive for America.
Well, I would say on electric vehicles, I have a different issue. The government should not be subsidizing electric vehicles in the first place. And in part, what happened with that open trade agenda with China is that the so-called free trade agenda was actually imbalanced from the start. However, this is a crucial point where I differ from a lot of the national protectionists. If you're serious about declaring economic independence from China in certain critical sectors, like pharmaceuticals, that actually means more trade, not less trade with allies, like Japan, South Korea, India, European allies. So I think that's a little bit of a difference even within the America First movement. There are those who are protectionists, focused on exclusively protecting American manufacturers and American workers. Whereas what I believe is that we have to look after our national security and our national identity, not just economic growth.
Just to be clear, because what happens with China and the US, the world's two biggest economies, has a huge impact, doesn't it, on global trade and global economies. Under a Trump administration, are you saying that you would hope that in certain areas there would be no trade at all?
I think the U.S. should not be dependent on China for our own military industrial base. 40% of the semiconductors that go into U.S. military equipment come from China. China's the top supplier, in many cases, to the U.S. Navy, to the U.S. Air Force. It just doesn't make any sense. 95% of ibuprofen in the United States, medicine cabinets, come from China.
Which other sectors?
The first frontier of policy is sectors critical to U.S. national security. We should not be dependent on China, which today is an adversary, for our modern way of life. And yet that is the case today. So we, as a matter of focus and prioritization, that's where I would focus. But that necessitates more, not less, trade with other allies in addition to onshoring to the United States.
Jennifer, welcome back. We heard from Vivek, and we've heard these sorts of statements coming from the US, haven't we? Whether it's President Trump, whether it's President Biden. And in a sense, and you alluded to this before, does it push China to a bit more self-sufficiency in some areas?
It is. It also pushes China's East Asia and Mexico to find a way around these trade. Those points, though, about pharmaceuticals, for example. I mean, there is a sort of a misreading sometimes about how much the U.S. does rely on China, and certainly, especially for pharmaceuticals, this really high figure that their ibuprofen comes from China. According to the U.S.-China Business Council, they're saying that some of the active ingredients in pharmaceuticals, it might be less than 10%. I'm not saying that what he's saying is not valid. Like, the sentiment behind it remains, which is that perhaps American firms should not have all come to China and the whole world should not have relied on China to be its factory. I think that's fair because now it's sort of spreading out the wealth to Southeast Asia and other less developed countries who want a bite of the apple. And China for itself wants to move up this manufacturing chain anyways. But I have to state that, for example, with electric vehicles, just because, or let's say there are no tariffs and Chinese manufacturers can sell more of these cars to the US or to Europe, it actually doesn't do much for workers here in China because manufacturing is highly automated. This idea of who's a winner and loser doesn't really lay out so clearly, I have to say, because Chinese workers here don't necessarily feel that they are winning either.
Yeah, that is an interesting point on that area that had this idea that Jennifer was talking about going to Mexico, going to Hungary, and trying to get products in that way. That's worked to some extent, but we've already seen, haven't we, the US looking at Mexico and saying, hey, look, some of that steel can't come in because of the links with China then.
Absolutely. I think China, they're facing a bit of an existential challenge right now, where other trading partners such as the U.S., Europe, they look at China's overproduction as a level playing field issue, whereas China realizes, given that the economy is hinging on deflation and that the domestic market is very much facing a price war across all ranges of products, everyone knows in China that if you aren't exporting to markets where you can get higher margins, you're probably going to collapse internally. And so there's this huge rush by everybody to get more efficient, to invest, to scale up your investment. I don't always think it's a top-down initiative pushed by the central government. I think it's just basic economics and an intent to survive.
And as always, a pleasure having you on the program. Peter, your final thoughts on this particular debate. Hey, it's not China's fault it became the factory of the world, is it?
Well, in a way it is, because it's so heavily subsidized that it denies its population, a rising standard of living to accommodate that. But
they've seen incredible changes in the standards of living. It's been an incredible economic story.
Their navy cost them dearly. They could be living in suburban houses instead of very tiny apartments. But in any case, one of the things that all this brings out is people are very backward looking, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden. They talk about a manufacturing era that no longer exists. We're not going to provide quality jobs, good rising living standards for Americans or Britons or the French or the Chinese by relying on manufacturing. We need to be able to take care of our own needs so we're not dependent on our adversaries. But to think that promoting manufacturing is going to provide for the great masses a rising standard of living the way it did in Henry Ford's day is absolutely a fool's journey, because electric cars require many fewer people to make than internal combustion engines, and in turn they require many fewer people to make than they did a generation ago. Manufacturing is so efficient that if you don't think that manipulating ideas is the way to create jobs, then you're just not in tune with the way the world is evolving.
Jennifer, final thought to you, I promise this then. If you, as you said, that EVs and people think China's going to dominate that market, but it's heavily automated, so it's not going to create that many jobs. China has been the factory of the world, but if that's all becoming more automated, it's still a country of over 1 billion people. Where are the jobs going to come from?
Oh, that's the question, because the previous sectors, which was real estate, tech, and also academic tutoring, those were the booming industries, so much so that a lot of those companies went to New York to list. They are the ones that have now been hamstrung by Chinese regulations, because in many ways they had just kind of gone off the rails on so many levels that the government felt like it needed to be reined in. But it did so at a time when China was still in the middle of the pandemic. There was still a lot of uncertainties, so it's all coming at the same time. And what it results in is Chinese consumers feeling quite insecure about their wage growth, which is not going up as much. In many ways, they have their wages frozen, or they're not getting their bonuses. And so people are just not necessarily spending because they're just worried. Because again, much like in the US, people can go bankrupt here just if there's a major illness, or if they're trying to get their kids into a better school, or even for housing. So there's a lot of insecurity, and until China's government kind of lays that foundation, improves the welfare system here, people aren't going to spend much.
I sure wish President Xi would see the fact that his people and Joe Biden's people face the same insecurities because they're dealing with the same technology and the same global markets. This business of building navies to try to push each other out, it's such a fool's journey.
Absolutely, I agree. I think the Chinese and Americans are much more similar than a lot of people think.
Absolutely, because they're dealing with the same global marketplace. And these guys are dealing with the world as if it's some bloody chessboard.
There we go. And, diplomacy here, bringing people together, business about it. Peter, quick thought on this one.
Diplomacy works so well.
More than 130 companies with a combined revenue of more than $1 trillion are calling on governments to enact tough goals to reach a UN target of halting nature loss by the end of the decade. The companies, which include Unilever, L'Occitane, and as well as the energy group RWE, have signed an open letter, seen by Reuters, calling for market-wide rules to be set at the COP16 Biodiversity Summit in October. They say voluntary corporate action would not be enough, warning that the cost of losing species could be far higher than the cost of preventative measures. What struck me about this, Peter, was, why can't they do it themselves? Why do they need the government to tell them what to do?
Well, because if anyone acts on their own, it doesn't have much of an effect. You need rules so that everyone acts. It's like conservation with fishermen on a lake or in a bay. You need rules that limit catch, or if one fisherman limits his catch, the others, continue to do what they do. He just gets poor and goes out of business. So I think they're correct if they see the world in this way, to think that a common set of rules would help. The trouble is, they don't represent the world. There's so many places in the world that pollute, that emit CO2 that wouldn't be captured by that. That I think that these CEOs get captured by the theology of woke, and I think it's unfortunate.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are some people who hold those views. Others would say, look, hey, at least it's a start of trying to tackle what is clearly a big
I've
challenge.
been hearing at least it's a start since I was 19
Yeah, but
years
you have
old.
to
and I'm
start. You have to
75.
start.
I'm getting tired of starts.
Well, you should never get tired of it. We have to start sometimes. So, right, we're going to move on to this last one, which is sort of where we started the program, because as people process the news and images from Butler, Pennsylvania, from Saturday, some of that processing will occur at work, which can, like the rest of America, be a polarized place. We've spoken a lot about that, haven't we? SHOREM, the Society for Human Resource Management, has been doing some thinking about ways managers might guide these conversations. Johnny C. Taylor Jr. is president and CEO of the society. He spoke to David Brancaccio from our US Partners Marketplace. Let's listen in.
We saw this coming as early as 2019, that the workplace was becoming very, very hot.
So, civility, but what are some of the other guiding principles then?
Our research found that since the presidential debate, for example, 78% of surveyed U.S. workers reported experiencing or witnessing poor treatment because of their political opinions in their everyday lives. In the workplace, that number dropped, but it was still 64% of residents said they're experiencing or witnessing mistreatment in the workplace due to differences in political opinions. Thus,